theory, namely saying the real exchange rate should be equal to 1. Now, what is PPP, what is absolute purchasing power parity good for? Well, the theory of absolute PPP is a simple theory of the equilibrium real exchange rate. That is, it establishes a benchmark of where one should expect to see QT in steady state or on average. So if we have a theory of the real exchange rate, then we can say, okay, here's the real exchange rate that we observe. Does it support the hypothesis? And then we have two choices. Either we say, if we find no, we have two choices. Either the theory is not very good, or the exchange rate is wrong, right? And there's some under or overvaluation. And that's in fact the second bullet point. If we trust the theory of absolute purchasing power parity, it can be used to identify over and undervaluations of the nominal exchange rate. And this is where people get excited. Why? Because suppose you are in foreign exchange markets. Suppose you see that nominal exchange rates are going up and down. And suppose that you think you want to know, will the US dollar Vietnamese dong exchange rate go down or will it go up? And if you have a theory that gives you some guidance and say, okay, the dong is undervalued, so it's likely to go up. Well, actually, the dong is undervalued, so it's likely to appreciate, so it's likely to go down. Note we are in price notation universe. Then this is very valuable. And bless you. So, no, I mean it. So that's very useful if you trust it. Now there's, as I will later say, there's tons of reasons not to trust it, but let's first follow that road. How do we use absolute purchasing power parity to identify over and undervaluations? Well, now, if the real exchange rate is 1, you can, right? That's what absolute PPP says. Then you can turn that into ET equals PTH over PTF. And you can compute the nominal exchange rate that would prevail if absolute purchasing power parity held, right? So this, if you have information on the domestic price level and the foreign price level, you can compute the nominal exchange rate that you should observe if absolute purchasing power, if you believe in absolute purchasing power parity. And this thing, in fact, is called, this hypothetical exchange rate is called the purchasing power parity. So this is the second source of confusion. Sometimes talk about purchasing power parity, or in short, PPP, and what they mean is the theory of purchasing power parity. And sometimes people talk about purchasing power parities, and they mean the nominal exchange rate that should be observed if the theory of absolute purchasing power parity held. Now, for such a ratio to make sense, of course, we need the same goods baskets. Because, as I said, absolute PPP only makes sense if we assume that goods baskets are identical. And how you do that? Well, either you go to a goods basket that is standardized, or you construct one. And I want to show you two interpretations. Well, one of the most standardized products is the McDonald's Big Mac. I think McDonald's is not so prominent in Vietnam. Is it? Is it present? Did you ever eat a Big Mac?
Not in Vietnam.
Okay. Is it? Do you have a McDonald's chain in Vietnam?
Yeah, there are a few.
Okay. Well, it's in Germany there's lots of them. In the United States, it's all over the place, right? Now, the McDonald's Big Mac is kind of 3 slices of bread, 2 slices of beef, and stuff, right? And it's a standardized goods basket because it's the same in all countries. Okay, so the nice thing is you can actually compare McDonald's Big Mac prices. And that's what the Economist, the magazine or the newspaper as they call themselves, Economist, has been doing since 1986. But, oops, that's not very nice here. But first let me, okay, that's yummy. Okay, first let me pause on what the different interpretations of finding deviations from the purchasing power parity. Now suppose we compute the purchasing power parity, right? And then we see that the nominal exchange rate that we actually see on foreign exchange markets is greater than the purchasing power parity. Then this indicates that the domestic currency is undervalued because more local currency units, LCUs for local currency units, have to be paid for 1 unit of the base currency than suggested by the PPP, right? Or if you find that the purchasing power parity is smaller than the observed nominal exchange rate, that's, so if ETA PPP is smaller than ET, that means that PTH PTF is smaller than ET, and that is equivalent to saying one is smaller than ET PTF or PTH, and that's the real exchange rate. So the second interpretation is, if you find that ET PPP is smaller than ET, then that means that the real exchange rate is greater than 1. So the real exchange rate is greater than 1, so apparently the currency is undervalued. Finally, the third interpretation is, if you find that the purchasing power parity is smaller than the observed nominal exchange rate, then this is like saying so if ET/PPP is smaller than ET, that's equivalent to saying PTH over PTF is smaller than ET, and that's equivalent to saying that PTH is smaller than ET PTF. That's like saying the goods bundle is cheaper in domestic currency than the foreign currency. Now, this may look to you like, hair splitting, but it's important to see these different perspectives, right? It's always the same starting point. You realize that the nominal exchange rate is greater than the purchasing power parity. And there's different interpretations that all come to the same conclusion. You say you have to pay, if this is the case, then you have to pay more in local currency than what PPP suggests. Or you say the real exchange rate is greater than 1. So the goods bundle is too cheap at home. And here you directly compare the goods bundles and you say, in fact, the goods bundle is cheaper in the home currency than the foreign currency if translated into the domestic currency using the nominal exchange rate. Now let me come to this thing. Have you ever seen this? At the beginning, yep, right, okay. Thanks. But not before. Super. So there's a weekly magazine called The Economist. They call themselves a newspaper, but newspaper is usually big, things, but The Economist is a small, basically magazine, and it appears once a week. And I don't want to advertise this magazine. I think it's very useful because it is where the essential, economic discussions from a global perspective take place. When you take the Wall Street Journal, right, it has an incredibly American perspective, right? And Europe and Asia is just, markets. When you take the Financial Times, it has an incredibly UK perspective. When you take The Economist, they try to really be kind of the global forum where discussions take place. So they discuss Asia, they discuss Europe, they discuss Africa, they discuss all parts of the world. Now, since 1986, bear in mind, since 1986, The Economist has been publishing this type of data. And what they did, or what they've been doing here, with an increasing number of countries involved, is they give you the Big Mac price in local currency units. LCU is local currency units. Right? There it is. And then so you have the Big Mac price for lots of countries in different currencies. Now, bear in mind that these are very different numbers, right? Because in Vietnam, I don't know what a Big Mac costs in Vietnam, but I think that's probably a five-digit number, if not a six-digit number. Probably a six-digit number. I would guess 80,000 or 100,000. I don't know. I've never been to a McDonald's. It also.
I think it will be close to 100,000.
Okay, good. So you see, thanks. So you see that this is in Colombian pesos. This is in Korean won. Then of course you have Peruvian pesos, the Norwegian kroner, right? You have all these currencies. Now, what The Economist does as a next step is it computes the purchasing power parity. And then it compares the purchasing power parity to the observed nominal exchange rate, and this is from January 2025, so this is fairly recent. And then it comes to the conclusion that some currencies, relative to absolute purchasing power parity in January 2025, were overvalued and some currencies were undervalued. So let me give you an example. And the example is Taiwan. So how much who knows what the Taiwanese currency is called? It's interestingly the Taiwanese dollar. So in January 2025, a Big Mac costs 78 Taiwanese dollars in Taiwan. Okay. Oops. So how do you compute the purchasing power parity? Well, you divide the Taiwanese price in Taiwan dollars by the American price, which is up there in 5.79 US dollars. I should have something else here. Nope. Okay, you divide 78 by 579. So you get 13.47, which is this number here, which is the purchasing power parity. Now, you compare the purchasing power parity to the price that had to be paid, the amount of Taiwanese dollars that had to be paid for $1 US on foreign exchange markets in January 2025, which is at that time was 32.73. You divide 13.47 by 32.73 and you get 0.41. And that is interpreted as a 59% undervaluation of the new Taiwan dollar. Okay, it's called the new Taiwan dollar, by the way. Taiwan had a currency reform some years ago. So if you trust that, you would say, oh, the Taiwanese dollar is a bargain, right? It's too cheap. Don't buy Taiwanese dollars right now because there's much more to say on that, right? But if you are naive, you would say, well, that's heavily undervalued. When something's heavily undervalued, then there's a tendency to prices to increase. When something's heavily overvalued, then there's a tendency for prices to decrease. So this is something, when you talk to foreign exchange traders, do you know this stuff? Do you know the Big Mac index? They will say, yes, of course we do. when you ask them, do you take this serious? They will say, kind of, right? Not, I think we know that there's much more to say about real exchange rates than just absolute purchasing power parity, but absolute purchasing power parity somehow belongs into the picture. Now, when you look at that, you see that the dollar was, of course, not over and not undervalued against the dollar, that's for sure. But you see that, for example, the Argentinian peso was overvalued. You see that the Azerbaijan, I don't even know what the currency is, dinar, I think, was undervalued. The Brazilian real was undervalued. The Swiss franc was heavily overvalued, right? And you go down, you see that the euro was slightly overvalued. And you see that the Norwegian kroner is slightly overvalued. Okay, so this is fancy, and it's kind of, but the Economist has been doing this on a semi-annual basis for almost 40 years now, and people know it. And it's a nice way to illustrate absolute purchasing power parity. Now, what you can do is, what the problem with this approach is, of course, that this is just one good, right? The Big Mac, which you could interpret as a goods bundle. The OECD, which is an important policy institution, computes purchasing power parity based on much broader currency baskets, and let me show them. So this is the purchasing power parity for the UK against the dollar and the observed exchange rate, right? So this is purchasing power parities against the dollar and the US dollar British pound exchange rate. And what you see is that by and large, and that's important, for the British pound, there's a fluctuation around, this purchasing power parity. So there are instances when the blue line is above the red line, but then it has a tendency to come down again. And there are instances when the blue line is below the red line, there's a tendency to come back. For Spain, you see that it's not that clear cut. For Korea, you see that, interestingly, the exchange rate, the observed exchange rate is persistently above the purchasing power parity. So you would argue the Korean won was, against the dollar, relative to purchasing power parity, constantly undervalued, because you had to pay more Korean won for $1 than what was suggested by purchasing power parity. And when you talk about the Colombian peso, big discrepancy, right? The Colombian peso, according to this picture, is heavily undervalued if you take absolute purchasing power parity as the benchmark. Now, where will I take you from here? Well, I will take you from here towards the next step, where we have a more sophisticated theory of the real exchange rate. Absolute purchasing power parity is the starting point. We have to go beyond that. Now, let's move from absolute purchasing power parity. Do you have a question? Do you have a question? If so, please ask it. No? Interrupt me if there's something that is not clear. Okay, good. Okay, so the theory of absolute PPP cannot be applied if the CPI base is used to reflect the foreign and domestic price level. Why is that? Well, because indices are indices. Let me give you an example. Purchasing power parity, absolute purchasing power parity, is all about comparing price levels. And what I want to illustrate to you is that this doesn't make sense when you use an index like the CPI. So, suppose you have two countries. Right? You have country A and you have country B. Now suppose you're referring to the same goods basket. The price of the goods basket in country A goes down, the price of the goods basket in country B goes up. So which was, suppose this is period, suppose we look at period 0, which country was the expensive country, which country was the less expensive country? Pardon?
Country B, the expensive country.
Why should country B be the expensive country?
You begin from the
Yeah, from 0.
So the A, the expensive one.
Okay,
And the B, the less expensive one.
right. In 0, country A is expensive, country B is inexpensive. What about period cap T? Which country is the expensive one? Which country is the inexpensive one?
A still be the expensive one.
Mhm.
B is still the less expensive one.
Exactly. I mean, the price difference has changed, but it's still that country A is more expensive than country B. Now, let's transform this into indices. And let's make country, so that's normalize both prices at 100 in the base period 0. Now, what would that look like? We would have an index A, no, that would be the index B, T, and that would be the index AT. Now it seems like country B is more expensive than country A, but that's only because we've normalized both prices to 100 in the base period. That's the index. So the index itself only tells you that this price has gone down, this price has gone up, but at no point or this index has gone down, this index has gone up, but it doesn't tell you anything about the cross-sectional price differences. That's the problem with indices. So when you learn that the Korean CPI is at 140 and the German CPI is at 120, that doesn't tell you that the Korean price level is higher than the German price level. It would be foolish to make such a statement, right? And so we cannot use the CPI to compute, we cannot put it into absolute purchasing power parity. So such a statement like let me be very quick. Makes no sense at all. Don't do that, right? For that reason, right? Because we don't know, I mean, this is a comparison of levels, and we know, and an index doesn't tell us anything about levels. It just tells us something about the change relative to some base year. And as long as we don't know the price, what the price difference across countries were in the base year, we cannot make any, this might be seriously misleading. So never ever put the CPI of two countries into such, and expect and say this should be equal to 1. Now, having said all these nasty things, let me now turn on a more to a more positive approach. So this is what I've just said. As an index, the CPI offers no information on relative price levels in the base year. And also, I mean, on top of that, we have to be aware that consumer price, the composition of CPIs is likely to differ across countries. So the weight of certain things in Vietnam is very different from the weight of certain things, the same things in the German goods basket. So we are comparing apples and pears. So, however, there is something that we can do with a CPI-based real exchange rate, which is apply relative purchasing power parity. Now, relative purchasing power parity is like the soft cousin of absolute purchasing power parity. Absolute purchasing power parity says the real exchange rate has to be equal to 1. Okay? Relative purchasing power parity says, the real exchange rate should be constant. Could be 5, could be 360, could be 0.9. It just should be constant over time, right? So this is a much softer theory than absolute purchasing power parity. And it's much softer because it uses much less assumptions. So you don't need identical consumption baskets. You can use indices. And the theory is the real exchange rate should be equal to Q, some constant value. How do you know Q? Well, you'll be surprised by what people have come up with. What is now, this is the US dollar Swiss franc CPI based real exchange rate. How did I compute it? Well, I took the US dollar Swiss franc exchange rate, nominal exchange rate, I multiplied by the US CPI and I divided by the Swiss CPI. And that's what I got. Now, question is this a constant? You probably expect something to be hidden here. There's nothing hidden. Is this a constant? No. Okay. Sorry about asking such a dumb question. So this is not a constant, right? It moves around. So what does that say about relative purchasing power parity? It's not such a good concept in the short run. However, when you stare at that for a while, what do you observe?
It's like it's converging to a certain point.
Exactly. It seems like when it goes up, it's likely to go down as well, again. When it goes down, there's a tendency to go up again. So there's this mean reversion tendency, obviously apparent in the data. I'm not allowed to write on that surface, but I would probably say, here's something like a long run average. And so that's kind of interesting because the real exchange rate is not a constant, but there seems to be a tendency to return to some long run mean. So when there's a strong real depreciation of the Swiss franc in real terms, then there is a tendency to appreciate. And when there's a strong appreciation in real terms, there's a tendency to depreciate. That's the first thing to note. Secondly, we can take another perspective on the real exchange rate, namely the cross-sectional dimension. Now, relative purchasing power parity claims that the real exchange rate is constant. Now, the real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate times the foreign price level, the CPI, for that matter, divided by the domestic price level. Now, ET increases over time if the domestic currency depreciates, right? If the growth rate of the nominal exchange rate is greater than 0. Please note, E going up means you have to pay more domestic currency units for 1 unit of the foreign currency, so a depreciation. This ratio decreases over time if the domestic price level grows faster than the foreign price level. That is, if the domestic inflation rate pi h is higher than the foreign inflation rate pi f. That if that's greater than 0. Now, to keep the real exchange rate constant, you need the constant